Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 3rd of December. Today we're going to be talking about new gains on the Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and Kreminna fronts. We're going to begin with Avdiivka southern flank around Pervomaiske. In this area, we have a geolocated video from Ukraine's 59th Motorized Brigade showing their drones dropping munitions as Russian infantry advances through parts of Pervomaiske that were previously imagined to be under Ukrainian control. So if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, I talked about how the Ukrainians had defensive positions in the perimeter of southern Pervomaiske that was able to withstand attacks from the Russian forces head on. Well, it appears that in the weeks following that report, the Russian forces increased the ferocity of their assaults, not just on the ground, but also due to artillery and aerial bombardment, a lot of drones being launched onto the Ukrainian forward positions in this region. So a lot of that contributed to the Ukrainians' forward positions being degraded, and that eventually forced them to withdraw to a new line that's located a bit further to the north. If we measure the comparison of the Ukrainian withdrawal, it's about 600 meters northwest. And the Russians then moved into this area and established control over this specific polygon. And as the Russians took over these new positions, which include trenches, the Ukrainian forces from the 59th Brigade, they sent their drones that drop munitions onto the Russian infantry located in these trenches that were built by the Ukrainians and some of the houses that are severely damaged in this part of the village. Now, speaking of Pervomaiske, on December 1st, there was a report by Rybar that talked about new movements on the front line, specifically in Avdiivka, and there was mention of changes around the southern and northern flanks of Avdiivka. On the northern flank, I could verify the claims made by Rybar because there is geolocated videos to back it up. On the southern flank, though, I can't provide any sort of video evidence, so I'm making that clear, and that's why I'm going to be reporting this not as a definitive fact, so just keep that in mind. But it is still important to mention it because this is a very important part of the front line, and it is a very interesting claim. And so the claim made by Rybar is that the Russians were able to advance 1 kilometer westwards from their initial positions, which I still have marked on the map. So the original position is around this specific tree line, and then you could see that a 1 kilometer advance is around this point over here. So the Russians were able to, according to this report at least, advance through this open field adjacent to the pond near Vodiane, and basically advance into these areas over here just on the eastern outskirts of Pervomaiske itself in sort of a flanking operation. And Rybar, they claim that a big reason why the process of advancing along these fields took so long is because of the vast amount of mines that were laid by the Ukrainian defenders, which made it difficult for vehicles to advance through this region. And they also claim that the Ukrainian resistance was very stiff, but that it decreased over the past couple of weeks, which could also explain the minor Russian gains that occurred in the southern part of Pervomaiske. So I'm going to have to wait for more information before verifying that. And then looking at Severne, there are changes around here. Again, Rybar claims that the Russians were able to form this salient that starts off from this tree line over here. So there is a disagreement between my depiction of the front line and Rybar's. Rybar's initial claim before December 1st is that the line of contact was along this specific tree line, and mine was that it's along this tree line. Nonetheless, Rybar's claim is that the Russians were able to advance their infantry and form the salient through the open fields. And the reason for doing this, I believe, would be to first of all put pressure onto Severne's flanks from this direction over here. And that's extremely important because attacking Severne head on is very difficult. The Ukrainians are dug in this defensive node, and attacking it from different directions is important. And it's equally as important to attack the supply lines leading into Severne. And by advancing along this field, and if we were to just go by Rybar's logic, it would be an 800-meter advance. They would be able to get firing points that are closer to the village of Tonenke. Tonenke is a very important village, just like Severne, because all the supply lines that are leading into Severne go through Tonenke, and then from Severne they branch out into either the Chimik residential district in Avdiivka, which is a very large defensive node with a lot of high-rise apartment buildings, or into the fortifications in the southern outskirts of Avdiivka. So that explains the significance of Tonenka and Severne and why the Russians have continued to launch assaults over here. Even on the first day of the offensive, they were launching mechanized assaults in this region, which were largely repelled. So now we're seeing smaller scale infantry attacks on the flanks. So we're going to have to see the full extent of the results of those attacks. And the even larger attacks occurred on Severna's eastern flanks, and that's not entirely to do with Severna, as I'm going to get into in a second. But again, Rybar's claim, which is not backed up by any sort of visual evidence, is that, first of all, this was the pre-December 1st line, and that following that point, there was another salient developed by the Russian forces in this region, which was able to get control of these regions over here. And so the claim being made by Rybar would basically be that the Russians advanced, let's actually take out the measuring stick for this, they were able to advance about 1.3 kilometers to the north on Severna's eastern flank and nearly reach one of the supply lines that goes through Severna and reaches the Chimik residential district. This specific road over here, which is a dirt road, but is still very important for the supply lines leading into southern Avdiivka, and that they would be able to cut off the supply line that leads into the southern parts of the Chimik district, because you could see here that this road, and I'll mark it in yellow actually, this road branches off and goes south, and then it takes this eastern turn and then goes north and goes into the southern entrance of the Chimik district. This has been used by Ukrainians even though it's very close to the line of contact, and they may still be using it if the Rybar report is incorrect, but either way it shows that the Russians are trying to put pressure onto this region. And it's not just about the supply lines. There's a tree line that's adjacent to this road that leads into Chimik, and there's a trench that runs along the area. And so there is a forward Ukrainian defensive position that was built up for the specific reason of preventing the Russians from overrunning the supply line in that region. And so that's a part of the rationale behind attacking this entire area. But additionally, if you were to look at the topographic map, which I did, the area just to the west, basically, of the Chimik district, around this red square or red rectangle, I believe, is in relative terms actually in higher elevation than Severna. So the Russians attacking this direction and attempting to take it over, the goal would also be to get control of these heights that are overlooking the Ukrainian positions located in and around Severna. And it also gives them the opening point to, first of all, cut off, but then enter into the Chimik district and flank the Ukrainian positions that remain in Tsarska Ochota defensive node. So I apologize for putting you guys through that part of the video, but now we finally have the area of the front with the geolocated footage, and that is specifically on Avdiivka's northern flank. So south of Stepove, we're actually seeing a lot of activity in comparison to previous weeks. The Russian, or actually the 1st Army Corps of DPR's 114th Motor Rifle Brigade, has been sending their infantry closer and closer to the actual line of contact around the rail line. So a lot of their infantry squads are reaching those points and then actually crossing over. So there is some footage to back this up with infantry trying to cross over, especially during the nighttime past the rail line and then making it into the fields and the tree lines that are located to the south of Stepove. So here's a video from December 1st, which actually shows Russian infantry approaching the entrance to the coke plant. And at that point, they were hit by Ukrainian snipers. Most of the rounds fired missed, but either way, it shows you why the Russian forces are being cautious in this region. It is a very open area, and even at nighttime, they are susceptible to being spotted by the Ukrainian reconnaissance and being fired upon. So they do have to be extremely cautious when they advance past the rail line, because at that point, it is a very open area. But you could see the goal, at least on a local level, to cross past the rail line and the tree line, and then make it to this entrance over here. Because if you zoom in, you can see the entrance to the coke plant is located in this fence area, and you can see the rail line that runs through that fence. So the Ukrainians still have a presence in this region and are defending. They actually have a video from, I believe, the 2nd of December or 1st, doesn't really matter, but it's an infantry squad from the 47th Mechanized Brigade. So these are Ukrainian defenders. They ambushed a Russian force that was able to make it to the outside of the coke plant near that fence, and perhaps they were trying to gain reconnaissance or establish a forward position in that region, and they eliminated the Russian force that was located over there. And then at that point, they began engaging with a Russian drone that was spotted above them. So this gives us an idea that the Ukrainians are still actively defending against Russian incursions from this region. But an area where they were less successful in repelling Russian assaults was a bit further west around here. The Russians were able to establish positions in the fields and tree lines to the west of the rail line. And you can see the maximum extent of the Russian gains is about 820 meters. So we have this geolocated video here, not this one over here, of the Russians taking over that trench. And they took it over from elements of Ukraine's 45th Rifle Battalion, which was originally its own independent battalion, I believe, but it was eventually incorporated into Ukraine's 31st Mechanized Brigade. So that geolocation is over here, which means they have established partial control over this tree line over here. But you can see that the rest of it is still a gray zone. Either way, this means that the Russians are trying to flank Stepove and also gain positions to the north of the coke plant. Now, looking at Stepove itself, we do have a new geolocation from this region, which confirms a minor Russian advance. And it's yet again from the Marana group. This is a drone group we talked about previously. They're very active on the Stepove front, you could say. And so their FEVs in this video, they hit Russian positions located in houses in eastern Stepove. And as a result, I was able to move the front line a little bit to the west to indicate there was a slight Russian advance. And what we can see from these videos is that the Russians are, first of all, gradually advancing through this region, but also that they're beginning to establish positions in dugouts that are located within the outskirts of the village. So some of the FPV strikes in the video by Marana show that the Russians were dug in dugouts that were probably built by the Ukrainians and are now being employed by the Russians, which could show how they're gradually trying to make assert themselves basically past the rail line in this region. And of course, it comes with the cost of being hit by FPVs like the Marana groups whenever they are spotted by their reconnaissance. Just to the north of Stepove, we have a video that was released on December 1st, but could be really an earlier video. It does show Russian infantry overrunning the Ukrainian dugouts that were set up near the rail line, which could explain the process that the Russians had to go throughout the entirety of the rail line to clear it out. So this is just one example from the north, which does back up some of the claims of the Russian gains just to the north of Stepove. One gain that has not been confirmed yet, so I've not changed the map to back it up, is the claims of a Russian advance to the south of Novokalinove. So there's been a claim that started with Rybar, alleging that the Russians were able to advance through this region over here and take it over. And as a result, the new front line is basically separated by this small pond over here. There's still no proof of this, but if it were true, it would mean that the Russians were able to advance and will actually take out the measuring stick yet again, 800 meters. And this was through just lowland that is on pretty similar elevation to the Ukrainian defensive positions around Novokalinova over here. Although I would argue that the strongest Ukrainian positions in Novokalinova are located a bit further to the west around this area over here. Moving on to the Bakhmut front, we do have news about the village of Bohdanivka. Some Russian sources claim that the Russians were able to advance just to the northern outskirts, not entering yet, but approaching it, taking over positions in nearby fields. And Ukrainian general staff, they claim to have repelled all assaults directed at Bohdanivka. That could be true, but either way, according to Deep State Maps, so this is a pro-Ukrainian mapping source, they indicate that the Russians were able to conduct a minor advance and reach this tree line over here just to the northeast of Bohdanivka. This does imply that there was a Russian advance through these regions over here. So they were able to advance through fields and tree lines and conduct flanking operations on some of the Ukrainian positions, not just around Bohdanivka, but also to the north of the large Ukrainian, basically defensive hub to the north of Promove, located within this red rectangle. That is a very important part of Russia's operations in this area. It actually is the crown jewel of the Ukrainian defense in this region, and so it would be a big Russian objective in the longer term to clear out this entire area. Now, the last part of the front line that we're going to look at is the Kreminna Front, so spanning from these two cities over here. This is a part of the front line that's really been rather quiet in comparison to other parts of the front line. And now recently there's been an uptick in fighting over here. It's very interesting because also last winter there was some pretty heavy fighting around here, just around the time that the Russians were launching their offensive operations. And a big part of that was trying to relieve pressure off of Kreminna because the Ukrainians had established positions in the forested areas just to the west of Kreminna that were extremely threatening to that city. And in that regard, the Russians were able to establish a buffer zone to the west of Kreminna that spans several kilometers, and that's why they created the salient. You can see there's a bit of a salient in the front line that is sort of shaped like this. It protrudes like that. But in any case, the Russian goals of reaching the Zherebets River, for instance, or the broader goal of reaching the Oskil River were not achieved during those offensive operations. You can see the Ukrainians do still hold a bridgehead past the Zherebets River, and that is a thorn in the Russian side, which makes them continue to have to prepare with defenses and units being stationed in an area like Kreminna to prevent the Ukrainians from capitalizing on their positions across the river. And now, as of December 1st, we actually started seeing the Russians beginning to resume their offensive activities towards the Zherebets River, which is located over here, and towards some of the towns that are located to the east of the Zherebets River under Ukrainian control, like Terny and Yampolivka. So it was reported by Ukrainian sources that throughout the month of November, the Russians conducted troop rotations in the sector. And the three main units that have been involved in Russia's offensive activities towards the Zherebets River are three units, to my knowledge. So you have the 74th Motor Rifle Brigade, the 488th Motor Rifle Regiment of the 144th Motor Rifle Division, which is one of the divisions that is stationed around the Kreminna area. So a lot of its subdivisions are located around this entire front. And then you have the 35th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade. So those are the three units that are the main fighting force. And before December 1st, the front line that was widely accepted, it spans through this salient, basically. And then once you reach the border between Donetsk and Luhansk, it just runs along that border for a while. And that was generally accepted to be the front line between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. Now, on December 1st, it was reported by Deep State that the Russians were able to break past the Ukrainian forward positions and overrun some of their positions in tree lines and trenches that were set up in this region. And they took over a region that is roughly 6 square kilometers. So this is not the exact position. This is off the top of my head, but the Russian advance was generally in this region and was 6 square kilometers. You got to remember that the Ukrainians have many of their units that are defending against Russian assaults spread out in other parts of the front line, like the Kupiansk front or around Avdiivka, so you don't have that many resources diverted to this part of the front line that has largely been uneventful recently. And so in terms of the Ukrainian defensive composition, you don't really have many of these higher quality units, but you do have this drone group, tactical group Atom that has experience from the Bakhmut sector. And so eventually, after the initial Russian breakthrough, which secured some key positions like the ones I'm going to mark in red over here, the Ukrainians regrouped and actually conducted their own counterattacks. And that was reported by the same source that reported the initial Russian advances on December 1st, Deep State. On December 2nd, they reported a Ukrainian counterattack that retook some positions in these same tree lines located in the northern parts of the Russian breakthrough. So around here, the Ukrainians were able to retake some lost territory. And at the same time, the Russians were able to coalesce control over some of the tree lines they secured on December 1st. So around here and around here. And they actually expanded control further south and helped broaden the control they had within their salient. The salient that I'm talking about, as I said before, is the salient over here. So they expanded their control to include this tree line over here, which was previously located under Ukrainian control. So the Russians overran a Ukrainian defensive position over here and also overran Ukrainian positions in these bushy areas and paths over here. So you do see how the Russians were able to, in the span of a couple of days, take over certain Ukrainian forward positions that perhaps were not that well defended. And at the same time, you had Ukrainian forces regrouping and beginning to conduct some of their own localized counterattacks. So we're going to have to wait and see if this develops into a larger engagement or if this is just more positional warfare. And so thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.